The moment I stepped into my driveway, I knew something was wrong. Bright orange stickers covered my pristine Mustang, each one screaming violation. And it wasn't just any complaint this time. It was Karen from the HOA, the same woman who somehow runs the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. Fines, threats, and endless emails were now part of my daily life, all because my car dared to exist in my own driveway. But she didn't know one thing. I wasn't just any neighbor. I'm the police chief. And the question that's burning in my mind and will haunt hers: how far would she push someone who enforces the law for a living? The morning after the first warning stickers appeared on my Mustang, I discovered a flurry of emails in my inbox, thick, formal, and dripping with condescension. The HOA wasn't just upset about the car. It was personal. Karen had apparently decided that my choice of vehicle disrupted the visual harmony of our street. Though every neighbor's eclectic collection of cars somehow escaped scrutiny. The notices were precise: remove the vehicle, pay fines, attend meetings, or risk further penalties. Each email felt like a trap designed to make me doubt my rights, my judgment, even my sanity. At first, I tried compliance. I moved the car into the garage, polished it meticulously, and waited for the storm to pass. But the peace was short-lived. The next morning, more stickers each, one claiming a violation of neighborhood aesthetics or disturbance of common property standards. There was no guidance. No precedent, just rules pulled from thin air, enforced with alarming zeal. Each note felt like an accusation, each email a dagger to my pride. It wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about control. The HOA began showing up unannounced. Volunteers, or more accurately, self-appointed enforcers, walked the streets with clipboards, taking notes on my lawn, my hedges, even the angle of my driveway lights. I watched from my window as they whispered and pointed, measuring my property as if it were evidence in some petty trial. Every movement I made felt scrutinized, every minor imperfection documented. The frustration built like a storm cloud over my head. Every attempt to reason with Karen ended in condescension and veiled threats. Then came the fines. At first, they were small, a few $100s for unsightly visual impact. But the amounts quickly escalated, each notice more aggressive, demanding payment within days or face liens on my property. Letters arrived stamped with official seals and legal jargon that made my stomach churn. It was harassment under the guise of regulation, a relentless campaign to bend me to their will. And yet, there was a perverse artistry in the way they operated: rules rewritten overnight, arbitrary deadlines, and sudden emergency HOA meetings that seemed specifically timed to provoke stress. In the evenings, my mailbox became a battlefield. I found passive-aggressive notes slipped under my door, a neighbor complaining about a single squeak of my garage door, another claiming my garden gnome was offensive to community standards. Each letter tested my patience. Each one a reminder that the HOA's reach extended far beyond what any rational person would tolerate. It wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about power. Karen and her allies seemed to take perverse satisfaction in wielding it. I began documenting everything: the emails, the letters, even the tiny dents in the garage floor where their notes were tossed, photos, timestamps, recordings. Every petty violation became a piece of evidence, each interaction a note in a growing dossier. Yet, even with proof, the intimidation never ceased. The HOA sent notices accusing me of failure to cooperate, labeling me as unneighborly, disrespectful, and in violation of standards they could not even clearly define. It was Kafkaesque bureaucratic nightmare dressed up as community governance. Tensions escalated further when Karen orchestrated a surprise community meeting. The notice arrived like a weapon: mandatory HOA session all residents must attend. At the meeting, she presented a slideshow cataloging every infraction she claimed I had committed. My car, my garden, my garage lights, even my mailbox alignment were publicly critiqued. Whispers spread across the room like wildfire, neighbors nodding at her claims. Some out of genuine agreement, others perhaps out of fear. I felt the weight of scrutiny crush my chest, yet a flicker of defiance sparked inside me. They thought I was just a regular resident. They didn't know my background, my career, or the authority I carried with me. Then came the ultimatums. Pay the cumulative fines immediately. Remove any offensive items from my property or face legal escalation. The HOA hinted at liens, property assessments, and even threats of forced mediation. Each day became a strategic puzzle. How to comply without giving in. How to defend myself without provoking further attack. I could feel the stakes rising. Karen's satisfaction was palpable, and the more she pushed, the more relentless I became in my quiet preparation. And just when I thought the situation had reached its peak, a new escalation hit. Late one night, I returned home to find my Mustang blocked by a chain-link barricade, with a note claiming the street had been temporarily restricted by HOA authority. The absurdity of the action sent a chill down my spine. Blocking access to my own vehicle was no longer just harassment, it was audacious intimidation. The neighbors whispered, some with curiosity, others with approval, as I considered my next move. Could I escalate legally? Could I maintain composure while the entire community watched this battle unfold? The tension built like a coiled spring. Every notification, every email, every whispered complaint was another layer of pressure. I found myself sleepless, constantly strategizing, balancing the absurdity of HOA rules with the seriousness of their execution. Every action I took was scrutinized, cataloged, and weaponized against me. And yet, beneath the anxiety, there was a thrill, knowing that this was not just a personal battle, but a test of patience, law, and resilience. The story of the Mustang and the HOA was no longer a simple dispute. It had transformed into a psychological game of cat and mouse. A confrontation where pride, authority, and reputation collided. The next move would determine not just the outcome of the fines or the rules, but the balance of power in the neighborhood. And at that moment, I realized Karen had made one critical mistake. She underestimated who she was dealing with. And soon, the scales were about to tip. The day of the showdown arrived like a storm. The air was thick with anticipation, tension crawling over every neighbor and infiltrating every corner of my property. I had spent weeks preparing, documenting every violation, every overstep, every petty harassment. Files stacked neatly on my desk, photos meticulously cataloged, and recordings of whispered threats tucked safely into my phone. Every ounce of patience, every moment of quiet strategy had built to this point. Karen didn't know what was coming, and I intended to make her mistake unforgettable. It started with an official notice hand-delivered to my door. Final warning, immediate compliance required. Attend HOA hearing or face legal consequences. The words dripped with self-importance, the type of phrasing designed to intimidate. But this time, I didn't feel fear. I felt resolve. The mustard yellow Mustang gleamed in the driveway, untouched, unyielding, a silent symbol of defiance. For the first time, I realized the game had changed. I was no longer merely defending my property. I was holding the line against petty tyranny as the hearing began. I stepped into the HOA meeting room, a small, crowded space buzzing with expectation. Neighbors filed in, their faces a mix of curiosity, unease, and, in some cases, barely concealed amusement. Karen sat at the front, poised and smiling, as though she were already victorious. But the moment our eyes met, a subtle shift occurred. I wasn't just a resident anymore. I was authority, law, and preparation in motion. Her confidence, polished and smug for weeks, flickered ever so slightly. The meeting opened with a standard protocol: recitation of rules, listing of fines, and a long diatribe about community standards. Karen spoke with the practiced air of a self-appointed arbiter, citing violations so trivial they were laughable: the angle of a garage light, the type of welcome mat I'd chosen, and even the positioning of my recycling bins. Each point was meant to humiliate, to paint me as careless, irresponsible, and disrespectful to the neighborhood. But I listened silently, letting her words build, collecting each accusation like pieces of evidence. Then it was my turn. I rose slowly, deliberately, holding the weight of calm authority. I started by pointing out the inconsistencies in their rules, the way neighbors with far more visible violations were ignored, the arbitrary nature of fines, and the lack of legal basis for their demands. I presented my documentation: photos time-stamped over months, emails, recordings of previous confrontations, even notices where HOA members had openly admitted selective enforcement. With each piece of evidence, Karen's smug expression began to crack. She stammered, searching for counter-arguments that didn't exist. The tension in the room became electric. Murmurs spread among the attendees. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I could feel the power of preparation, of truth, pressing against Karen's fragile facade. Then came the bombshell, a legal twist that I had quietly confirmed before walking in. Several of the fines she had issued were not just arbitrary, they violated state regulations governing HOA authority and overstepped the limits of their covenants. I presented this, carefully citing statutes, regulations, and prior court rulings. The room fell silent. Karen's voice, once confident and sharp, faltered, then wavered into defensive excuses. Emboldened, I continued, explaining the extent of the harassment. The unannounced visits, the public shaming at meetings, the letters slipped under doors, all documented. I made it clear that her behavior wasn't simply petty, it was actionable. The evidence was overwhelming. Faces in the audience shifted from curiosity to shock, some nodding in understanding, others staring at Karen in disbelief. Her allies were silent now, unsure how to defend actions that were so clearly unreasonable. The moment of public reckoning was heightened by one last move. I revealed a recording of Karen conspiring with a few HOA volunteers to block my Mustang, an act that was not only absurd but potentially criminal. The evidence played in the room. Her voice, casual and vindictive, echoed in the quiet. You could feel the weight of it landing like a hammer. Gasps filled the room. Even the secretary, usually timid and compliant, looked at her with new eyes. Karen's carefully cultivated aura of control shattered piece by piece. At that moment, the meeting descended into chaos. Neighbors whispered among themselves, some questioning whether the HOA had gone too far. Karen tried to interrupt, to regain control, but every word she spoke sounded hollow, defensive, and transparent. Her power had evaporated under the weight of documented truth, legal authority, and the reality of a community witness to her overreach. It wasn't just a victory for MIT, it was an undeniable exposure of the absurdity and tyranny she had wielded for so long. Even then, the intensity didn't fade. Karen attempted a final act of intimidation, a threat to escalate, to take me to mediation or even to pursue liens against my property. But I was ready, calmly. I reminded her and the room that all of her previous actions had created a paper trail that legally protected me, and any attempt to escalate without justification could be reported to authorities. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The room absorbed every word, the implications clear. She had lost, and she knew it. The climax reached its peak when the HOA board, previously silent and hesitant, began questioning her decisions. The energy shifted completely. Karen, once the orchestrator of control, was now defensive, cornered, and visibly flustered. My neighbors looked on, seeing the power dynamic inverted before their eyes. I had turned every petty rule, every absurd fine, and every small act of intimidation back on the instigator herself. The entire community watched as the balance of authority shifted, and the absurdity of the entire campaign was laid bare. The room quieted, the tension hanging in the air like smoke. I could feel the collective realization settling over everyone present. The Mustang, the garden, the mailbox, they were never the issue. The issue was power, control, and the misuse of authority for personal satisfaction. And for the first time, that power was exposed, vulnerable, and held accountable. Karen's eyes darted around, searching for support that wasn't coming. Her kingdom had crumbled, not with violence or anger, but with preparation, patience, and unassailable evidence. Finally, the board reluctantly acknowledged that many of the fines were unenforceable, and that the methods used to intimidate me were inappropriate. Karen's reign of neighborhood terror was officially challenged, her credibility irreparably damaged. But the true triumph wasn't just in the paperwork or the rulings, it was the reversal of psychological control. The board, the neighbors, even Karen herself could feel it. The shift had happened, and it was irreversible. I left that meeting with a mixture of relief and vindication. Yet the climax didn't end quietly. As I walked back to my Mustang, the once symbolic target of oppression now gleamed in the sunlight, untouchable and triumphant. Every glance from neighbors carried acknowledgement, a silent recognition that the scales had tipped. Karen, meanwhile, remained a figure of fury and disbelief, facing the consequences of a vendetta that had unraveled. Spectacularly, in the glare of scrutiny, the battle had reached its peak. The tension, the harassment, the absurd fines all culminated in a decisive confrontation that would be remembered in the neighborhood for years to come. And as I slid into the driver's seat of my Mustang, I couldn't help but reflect. Sometimes, the most powerful victories aren't loud or explosive. They're measured, methodical, and undeniable. Karen had underestimated me, the rules, and the law itself. And in doing so, she had set the stage for the final, irreversible blow. The question lingered, heavy and electric. What would she do next, now that her control had been shattered in front of everyone? After the meeting, the neighborhood felt different, though the streets looked exactly the same. The bright sunlight reflected off my Mustang, undisturbed and gleaming, a quiet symbol of victory. Karen no longer had the same aura of control. The whispers and sideways glances that once bolstered her influence were gone, replaced by awkward silence whenever she attempted to assert herself. Her reign of petty enforcement had crumbled, leaving her vulnerable in a way that was almost poetic. The neighborhood had witnessed firsthand how her power could be challenged on how quickly. The scales could tip when one person refused to be intimidated. In the days following the confrontation, the HOA tried to regroup. Letters were sent out, filled with careful language and legal jargon, attempting to save face. But the community had seen the cracks, and Karen's credibility was irrevocably damaged. Her emails, once feared and detested, were now met with skepticism or outright dismissal. Neighbors who had quietly complied with her rules now questioned her authority, wondering how many of their own fines were arbitrary, how many complaints were personal rather than communal. The aura of unchecked HOA power had dissolved, replaced with uncertainty and cautious scrutiny. I began to notice subtle shifts in the way neighbors interacted with me. Some approached cautiously, almost in awe, while others quietly thanked me for standing up to the absurdity that had governed their lives. For months, small conversations at mailboxes and during evening walks hinted at a growing awareness. HOA rules could be enforced with fairness, or they could be weaponized against anyone who dared to resist. People began to speak up more openly during meetings, asking questions. challenging procedural inconsistencies and demanding transparency. The community that had once seemed fractured and fearful now had the spark of cohesion, drawn together by the lessons of my stand. The HOA board, meanwhile, had no choice but to revise its policies. Several fines were rescinded and rules clarified, rewritten to avoid ambiguity and arbitrary enforcement. New procedures were introduced: documentation of complaints, verification of violations, and an appeals process that actually worked. I watched as the organization that had seemed unassailable began to resemble something functional, accountable, and human. And while Karen remained on the board for a time, her influence waned, her comments now scrutinized rather than accepted without question. The very structure she had manipulated to intimidate residents was being rebuilt, brick by brick, in the wake of one decisive confrontation. On a personal level, the ordeal left me changed. The constant harassment had tested patience, restraint, and strategy. The victories, while deeply satisfying, were tempered by the awareness of how easily ordinary power could be misused. I became more methodical in my interactions, more observant of the subtle ways authority could manifest, and more committed to fairness and accountability. The Mustang in my driveway, once a simple expression of personal taste, had become a symbol of resilience and the principle that no one is untouchable in a community built on rules and appearances. Karen, predictably, reacted poorly. The first few weeks after the showdown were marked by thinly veiled attempts to regain influence. She would issue minor complaints, question procedural decisions, or attempt to rally sympathetic neighbors to her side. But each attempt was met with resistance, documentation, or polite dismissal. It was almost surreal. The same person who had wielded authority like a weapon was now diminished. A cautionary tale in her own community. The irony was palpable. Karen's downfall wasn't violent, dramatic, or explosive. It was methodical, undeniable, and public. And every time she attempted to assert control, it only reinforced the lessons of accountability she had learned too late. The wider neighborhood began to shift as well. Petty enforcement waned, and residents grew bolder in personalizing their homes, expressing themselves without fear of arbitrary fines. Lawns and gardens flourished according to individual taste. Cars parked with pride rather than secrecy, and small disagreements were mediated with reason instead of intimidation. The subtle culture of fear and obedience that had permeated the streets began to fade, replaced by cautious empowerment. It wasn't utopian no community is, but the balance had shifted. The mustard yellow Mustang, parked boldly in my driveway, served as a constant reminder: rules exist to protect, not to oppress. Yet the conflict left its mark. Karen remained bitter, nursing grievances privately and occasionally attempting to influence meetings from behind the scenes. Some neighbors were still cautious, remembering the months of harassment and fines. I understood this. Real change takes time, and old habits die slowly. But the difference was now visible. Where once the HOA ruled through fear, it now operated under scrutiny. Where once arbitrary fines went unchallenged, they were now questioned, documented, and, if necessary, legally contested. The dynamic had shifted permanently, and the neighborhood had gained a valuable lesson in accountability, perseverance, and the importance of standing firm. In retrospect, the ordeal had been a crucible. It revealed the absurdity of unchecked authority, the ease with which rules could be abused, and the power of preparation, strategy, and calm resolve. But it also illuminated the human side of community dynamics, how fear and intimidation can masquerade as order, how ordinary residents can be manipulated, and how courage, when combined with evidence and clarity, can overturn even the most entrenched control. The battle over a car, a garden, and a mailbox became a broader lesson on justice, fairness, and the consequences of wielding power irresponsibly. The final months of the aftermath were quiet but meaningful. Fines were refunded, documentation cleared, and new HOA elections introduced a more balanced and transparent approach to community governance. My Mustang remained in the driveway, untouched and admired by neighbors who now understood that rules were not to be feared but respected within reason. Karen, relegated to the background, faded from the center of attention. Her authority diminished, her influence carefully monitored. The community had endured the absurdity, confronted it, and emerged stronger, more cohesive and more aware of the delicate balance between personal expression and communal order. As I reflected on the journey, I realized the story was bigger than any one car or conflict. It was about resilience in the face of arbitrary power, the importance of documentation and strategy, and the courage to confront injustice directly. It was about the transformation that occurs when ordinary people refuse to be intimidated, when patience meets preparation, and when fairness is upheld even in the face of absurdity. The HOA's petty tyranny had sparked frustration, fear, and anger, but it had also catalyzed change, strengthened community bonds, and underscored the power of principled resistance. Neighbors approached me with stories of their own, anecdotes of minor disputes resolved quickly. And thanks for showing that the balance of authority could be challenged without chaos or violence. Children waved as I walked down the street, unaware of the drama that had unfolded, yet somehow absorbing the message that fairness and courage mattered. Even those who had initially supported Karen in small ways began to reconsider the dynamics of their community, questioning policies, procedures, and the human tendency to accept authority without scrutiny. The ripple effect was subtle but real, a reminder that standing up for oneself can empower others in ways that reach far beyond the immediate conflict. And yet, satisfying as the resolution was, the experience left a lingering question. How many communities allow arbitrary power to fester because no one has the courage, knowledge, or evidence to confront it? How many rules are enforced, not for fairness, but for control? And how many individuals silently comply, fearing repercussions that may never come? These questions lingered, a quiet reminder that vigilance, preparation, and resolve are always necessary, whether in a neighborhood HOA or any other system of authority. Ultimately, the mustard yellow Mustang remained in my driveway as a symbol of triumph, resilience, and the principle that justice can prevail, even against relentless pettiness. Karen's influence waned, the HOA became more transparent, and the neighborhood slowly returned to balance, stronger, wiser, and more aware of the consequences of unchecked authority. The experience transformed not only the community, but also my understanding of patience, strategy, and the subtle power of standing firm as the sun set over the street, illuminating the homes and lawns of neighbors who had witnessed the absurdity and survived it. I realized that the story wasn't just about a car or a neighbor. It was about the courage to challenge unfairness, the importance of evidence and preparation, and the transformative power of refusing to be intimidated. The HOA may have thought it was controlling a single resident, but in reality, the struggle had reshaped an entire community and left a lasting lesson in its wake. So the question remains, hanging in the quiet streets where rules and personal freedoms intersect, in the face of petty power, how far would you go to stand your ground?